She was bought like cargo, but he looked at her like a person. On the lawless edges of the galaxy, in a marketplace where dignity is stripped and lives are sold by the kilogram, an alien woman named Tyra stood on a rusted stage with chains around her neck and only one thing left to offer: the last of herself. Not for pleasure, not for power, but to save her dying child. The crowd laughed. They saw a body. He saw a soul. Jonas, a quiet human with dust on his boots and no reason to interfere, did something no one else had dared in years. He bought her. Not to own, but to set her free. And in that moment, in the middle of a crowd that mocked her pain, he didn't just break her chains. He shattered the rules of an entire galaxy. But when the slavers came to take her back, guns drawn, contract in hand, he stood in front of her and said the one thing no one had ever said before: "She's not yours." What came next was not about law. It was about choice. And one man's refusal to let a life be defined by a price tag. She stood in a place where hope had long been hunted to extinction. Vorax 9's underground market reeked of burnt metal, oil, and the breath of creatures who had given up their last dreams. Beneath cracked lights and leaking vents, shadows moved like insect traders of lives, buyers of pain. The air trembled with shouts, deals, and lies. A metal rod slammed the rusted stage. Next item: flesh contract, female, strong, quiet, half price. Voices barely paused. No one looked, no one cared, until she walked forward. Her name wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. She carried it in the way she moved, back straight despite the chains, chin up despite the dirt, gaze like broken stars trapped in a storm. Pale, blue-gray skin caught the light like moonlight in fog. Torn cloth wrapped her like silence. She didn't flinch as the crowd turned. Her voice was calm, too calm for this place. "I'm not for games, not for pleasure. I sell myself for credits. Enough to feed my child." A beat of silence. Then laughter. Someone spat. Another threw a scrap of food. One voice shouted above the rest: "She's broken, used up alien trash." But she stood still, unshaken. Even as boots scraped closer to mock her, even as the auctioneer sighed and turned away. "No bids? Move her out." A voice cut the noise. "I'll take her." Calm, human. The room stilled, heads turned. A man stepped out of the back, boots coated in red dust, coat too thin for the cold. He didn't look like a buyer, he didn't smell like power. But his eyes quiet, deliberate, cut through the smoke. He held up a small bag of credits. "Full contract," he said. The crowd murmured, some laughing, others watching with narrowed eyes. Was he drunk? Was he joking? But she didn't laugh. She stared at him, silent, waiting for the twist, the real reason. The auctioneer grinned, eager to get rid of her. Dirty papers were passed, thumbprints stamped. The chain connecting her collar to the stage changed hands. He didn't pull, he didn't tighten. He looked at the collar once, then reached into his coat, pulled out a worn tool, and with a soft snap broke it. The collar hit the floor like a sentence ending. She blinked. "You're letting me walk?" she asked. "You're free now." Her voice dropped. Not fear, just habit. "No one helps for free." His answer came like wind before the storm. "Maybe it's time someone did." He turned, walked toward the exit, and after the longest second of her life, she followed. Through the jeers, through the shadows, through the place where hope had once been buried, two strangers walked out side by side. And for the first time in years, the chains didn't follow. The silence behind them was louder than the crowd had ever been. The cargo freighter sat silent against the stars, engines low, like a heartbeat at rest. Scarred metal hull, faded markings. Nothing about it looked like a place where healing could begin. But the door opened. He stood there, Jonas, with one hand on the hatch, the other offering nothing but space and stillness. "Medbay's warm," he said. "You can rest there." She didn't move. Behind her, the market still roared, its smoke clinging to her skin, its words burning in her ears. Chains gone, but their ghost still wrapped around her neck. She stared at the ship like it might bite. Like stepping in meant losing something else. "You bought me," she said. "No," he answered. "I bought your freedom." The words didn't make sense. Not here, not in this galaxy. They hung in the cold air, strange and heavy. She didn't step forward, not yet. She watched him like one watches a trap they've seen too many times. "That's not how this galaxy works," she said without saying it. And he heard her anyway. "Then maybe it's time it should." He turned his back on her. Not out of disrespect, but out of trust. As if he expected her to follow. As if she still had a choice. That was the most foreign thing of all. She stepped aboard. Inside, the ship was quiet. No guards, no commands. Just the low hum of machinery and a single folded blanket on a medbay cot. He didn't speak. Just placed a bowl of food on the table and walked away. No demands, no eyes on her back. He gave her clothes. Soft, clean, too clean. He gave her silence, the kind that didn't weigh her down, the kind that said, "Stay as long as you need." She sat in the corner, fingers gripping the blanket like it might disappear. The warmth soaked in, slowly. Her body thawed before her trust did. Alone, under dim lights and old steel walls, she whispered to the air like a prayer with no gods left to hear it. "Just long enough. Let me live just long enough to send help." She didn't know he heard, but he did. He stood in the hallway beyond the door, one hand resting against the bulkhead, the other clenched at his side. And in that moment, without words, without reason, something in his chest ached. Not because he was broken, but because maybe, for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to feel again. She woke slowly, blinking into stillness. No shouting, no chains, no metal floors cold enough to burn skin, just quiet and the unfamiliar softness of a blanket still holding the warmth of her body. She sat up too fast, reflex. Her breath caught, ready for punishment that never came. The room was small but clean. A folded towel, a corner lamp, one door left unlocked. That detail hit harder than anything else. She moved barefoot, silent, steps light like a shadow through corridors of old steel and faded welds. The scent reached her before the source, something warm, spiced, cooking on heat. Her stomach clenched. Her throat forgot how to ask. She found him standing by a dented stove, stirring something in a battered pan. "You slept 12 hours, he said without turning. She stayed by the wall, arms crossed, eyes narrow. "Why didn't you lock the door?" He looked over his shoulder, calm. "Didn't need to." A pause. "You think I have nowhere else to go?" "I think," he said, "you don't trust me, yet." She stepped closer, cautiously. Like prey that's been hunted too many times. The table held two bowls. She stared at them. The food inside was steaming, real. Not nutrient paste, not rations, real. "Food's not poisoned?" she asked, tone sharp. "Nope," he said, flipping the pan off the burner. "But if you wait much longer, it might get cold." She sat, slow, back straight, eyes never leaving his hands. Her fingers curled around the bowl. The scent hit first memories of markets long gone, kitchens before war, a life with doors that used to stay open. She ate. Not politely, not like someone at peace. Like someone surviving. He didn't speak. He didn't watch her chew. He just sat across from her, quiet, letting the silence be whatever it needed to be. Halfway through the bowl, she looked up. "What do you want from me?" His face didn't change. "Nothing." Her grip tightened on the spoon. "No one buys a slave for nothing." "I didn't buy a slave." "You bought a life," she said, voice low. "No," he replied. "I saved a person." The words didn't hit like truth, not yet. They just sat in the room like a presence neither of them knew how to name. She finished eating, but didn't leave. Not because she trusted him, but because for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to run. The engine room whispered like an old memory, low hums, soft vibrations, the rhythmic breathing of a ship that had seen too much and still kept moving. Pipes ran overhead like veins. The floor beneath her was warm. Tyra sat alone, legs pulled up, her back pressed to the wall. Her eyes weren't on anything in particular, just a fixed point in the metal, something beyond it, something far away. The silence wasn't heavy here, it was honest. Her voice broke through it, quiet, rough-edged. "Her name is Chellen." The words dropped gently, but they hit hard. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. 7 cycles old, sick lungs. She was born during the last refugee storm. We were hiding in an old factory, no light, no heat, just broken walls and broken people. Jonas didn't move. He stood by the doorway, not intruding, just listening. She couldn't breathe right, Tyra continued, her voice softer now. Artificial air hurts her. Medicine costs more than a transport ship. She blinked hard, jaw tense. I worked where I could, cleaning, hauling crates, serving miners. Then someone said I was pretty enough to sell. A bitter smile touched her lips, quick and sharp. So I did. One contract, just enough to send help. I told myself that was all it would be. Jonas stepped forward slowly. He didn't speak. He simply placed a tablet beside her screen glowing soft blue, a single message displayed. She turned, confused. What's this? I sent a message, he said. To the Dome, Refuge K3, Sector 9. She reached for the tablet with shaking hands. Read the words once, then again. Recipient, Refuge Dome K3. Message sent. Mother is safe. Help is coming. Clearance code, 88B, Earth Civilian Relief Access. Her breath caught. How did you get this code? I used to work with supply crews during the collapse. I kept a few back doors open. She stared at the message. Her hands trembled. You didn't have to do this. No, he said. I didn't. Her voice cracked barely above a whisper. You had no reason. He knelt beside her, resting one arm on his knee. Maybe not, he said, eyes steady. But I had heart. She looked at him for the first time with suspicion. Not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. And in that tiny room filled with hums and echoes, the past didn't win. Not tonight. Space stretched endless around them, a sea of stars that offered no warning, no comfort. Then the beeping began. Soft at first, then insistent. A sharp pulse on the console, like a heartbeat going wrong. Jonas leaned forward in the pilot's chair, jaw tightening as the scan came into focus. No transponder, no beacon, no registration. Just a shape, a long dark vessel cutting through the black like a blade. He didn't need to guess. He recognized the design. He'd seen it once, years ago. The Syndicate. He stood fast. Get to the back, he said, already moving to power up the shields. Tyra appeared in the doorway. Her eyes met his. Cold, clear. I'm not hiding. He turned to protest, but she was already gripping the wall rack, pulling down a stun baton. Her hands didn't shake. Not this time. The ship rocked as the enemy latched on. Metal groaned. Lights flickered. The hiss of forced entry sliced through the silence. Boots, heavy, dozens, slamming down the corridor like thunder. Jonas stood in the main passage, armed, breathing slow. Then he saw a line of slavers, armed and grinning. One step forward, larger than the rest. His skin was scaled, dark and polished like stone. We came for what's ours. Jonas didn't flinch. She's not yours. The slaver smirked. Everything's property to the right buyer. Weapons rose, fingers found triggers. But Tyra moved first. A blur of motion, a crack of light. The baton struck flesh with a burst of electricity. The lead slaver dropped with a grunt, body convulsing. And the corridor exploded. Gunfire, smoke, sparks, the hiss of wires burning, shouts in 3 different languages. Jonas fired. 1 shot, 2, a third missed and ricocheted down the hall. Tyra fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. No hesitation, no fear, just precision. When it was over, the hallway was scorched. 3 Syndicate slavers lay on the ground. The others gone, fled back into the dark where they came from. Jonas leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Blood trickled down his arm. Tyra stood still in the smoke. The baton slipped from her hand. Her chest rose and fell, fast and fierce. She turned to him. You could have sold me, she said, voice raw. They would have paid. He shook his head. That was never an option. She looked at him for a long moment. And then, not out of obligation, not out of survival, but from the center of something human, she said, thank you. And for the first time, the words meant exactly what they sounded like. The galley was dim, lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed gently with each drift of the ship. The hum of the engines was distant now, more like breathing than motion. Between them sat 2 bowls of rehydrated stew, steam curling up like ghosts of simpler days. They didn't speak for a while. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore, it was worn, familiar, almost soft. Spoons clinked against metal. She ate slowly now, not with fear, just with thought. Her eyes didn't move much, but they watched everything. Then, without looking up, she said it. "You should have left me." The words weren't sharp, not angry, just flat, like a fact she'd repeated to herself too many times. Jonas didn't respond right away. He swallowed, set his spoon down, and leaned back slightly. "You brought danger," he said quietly, "but also purpose." She finally looked at him. That word didn't belong in her world. It was too clean, too hopeful. "Purpose?" she repeated as if testing its weight. He nodded, not smiling, not trying to comfort, just telling the truth. "Before you," he said, "I was just flying." She held his gaze, searching for a catch, a joke, a reason to retreat behind the walls she'd built. But there was nothing in his eyes but stillness, the kind that doesn't come from absence but from anchoring. Something shifted, not loud, not sudden. Just a breath, drawn deeper than the ones before. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to reply. She just let the silence stay. And this time, it felt safe. The storage cabinet creaked open with the soft hiss of aged hydraulics. Metal shelves lined the narrow space, cluttered with parts, tools, and things long forgotten. But his hands didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where to reach. She stood in the doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest, still half expecting something to snap. He turned and placed 3 small vials into her hands. Clear, labeled, sealed. She looked down, slowly. "Oxygen boosters," he said, voice low. "Nutrient supplements, enough for 2 months." Her fingers closed around them, like they might disappear. She didn't breathe. "Where did you—" Her voice caught halfway through the question. "Where did you get these?" He met her eyes. "My last credits." The silence cracked. "You what?" she whispered. He didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. The vials trembled in her grasp, but not from weight. Her jaw locked, trying to hold back what was already breaking through. One tear escaped. Just one. It rolled down the edge of her cheek like it had been waiting for years. She caught it quickly, almost violently, as if ashamed of its existence. "I don't cry for humans," she said, her voice barely there. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Then I'll cry for you," he said. And that simple, sentence, gentle, unflinching hit harder than any kindness she'd ever been offered. She looked at him then, truly looked. And for a fleeting moment, she wasn't a souled body, a survival machine, a name lost in registry. She was just a mother. A woman. Seen. The ship touched down with barely a sound, its landing struts settling into the smooth earth outside the dome. No alarms, no guards, no guns. Just a breeze moving across the landing field, stirring dust and memory alike. Tyra stood at the edge of the open ramp. Her breath caught the moment she saw it. The dome had changed. It wasn't broken anymore. Not like the last time. The roof was intact, the outer walls reinforced with steel and care. Lights blinked in quiet rhythm. Green vines curled gently up the sides, a sign someone had planted something and expected it to grow. She stepped down slowly, as if the ground might vanish beneath her feet. Her voice cracked the silence. What if she forgot me?" Jonas didn't speak right away. He stood beside her, hands loose at his sides, eyes soft. "She remembers," he said. It was a simple answer, but it rang like truth. They walked through the outer gate, past the checkpoint where no one stopped them. Faces turned, medical staff, aid workers, a nurse pushing a cart. All pausing, all recognizing something they couldn't name. A woman who had clawed her way back from the edge. A mother who had not broken. The nurse guided them down a hallway, no questions asked. Just a nod. Just reverence. At the last door, Tyra stopped. The nurse opened it. Inside, the room was small, but full of light. A single bed near the wall. A toy, half broken, but held with care. And sitting on the sheets, legs swinging off the edge, was a little girl. Pale blue-gray skin. Wide silver eyes, full of light and something older than her years. Tyra stood frozen in the doorway. The girl looked up. No confusion, no hesitation. Just one word. Mother? Tyra dropped. To her knees. To the floor. To the moment that had haunted every breath since the day she left. Her arms opened before her heart could catch up, and Shellen ran. The child slammed into her chest like gravity, like home, like life returning. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They held each other as if the universe had gone quiet just to watch. Jonas stood near the door, silent. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He just watched, his eyes damp, his heart pounding for the first time in years, not with fear, but with relief. And for the first time since Vorax 9, Tyra didn't feel broken. She felt found. The council hall of the outer colonies was carved from stone and silence. Its walls were tall, its lights cold. A chamber built to intimidate, not to welcome. Every sound echoed, every step was watched. And in the center of it all stood a woman no longer shackled, no longer bowed. Tyra. She wore no collar now. No chains, no brand, no price tag on her skin. Just a woven cloak from the refugee dome, soft, earth-toned, handmade. Her daughter stood beside her, small fingers tangled in her own. Jonas stood one step behind. Not in front, not above, beside. The speaker's voice filled the hall, sharp and brittle like glass under pressure. You were purchased illegally from an unregulated market. By law, this case must be reviewed. Tyra raised her chin. I was not purchased. A pause spread like ripples through the room. I was saved. The speaker frowned. Council members shifted. Eyes narrowed. You claim this human rescued you. Tyra nodded once. He had every chance to own me. He never did. A murmur moved through the chamber. Some skeptical, some surprised. One of the elders leaned forward, hands folded. You love him? The question cut through the air. Tyra didn't flinch. Number. The elder raised a brow. Tyra stepped forward, not defiant, but certain. Her voice rang clear, without tremble. I chose him. That silence, the one that followed, was different from all the ones before. It wasn't born of doubt. It was born of understanding. And for the first time in a place ruled by codes and contracts, someone spoke not of ownership, not of legality, but of choice. Pure, undeniable, unrepayable. The stars outside their window drifted like old song, slow, eternal, wrapped in silence. The home was small, a cabin of welded steel and glass, tucked into a hillside overlooking the curve of a moonlit plain. No fences, no guards. Just open land and sky, and the soft hum of peace where chaos used to live. Inside, the air smelled like warm spice and metal. Tyra stirred something in a battered pot, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely tied. Her hands no longer shook, her eyes no longer scanned for exits. Shellen sat cross-legged near a viewport, flipping through a data pad, lips moving as she read. The broken toy from the dome rested in her lap, still cracked, but never abandoned. Jonas knelt near a console, adjusting a fuse with one hand, wiping grease from his fingers with the other. The moment was quiet. Not empty. Alive. Shellen looked up suddenly. Are we safe now? Tyra paused at the stove. Her eyes met her daughter's, a small smile, barely more than a breath. We are. Jonas leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Forever? Tyra looked at him, really looked, then turned her gaze back to the window, where the first light of another planet's morning began to edge across the distant ridge. One sunrise at a time. She walked toward him, stopped just close enough to feel his breath, then reached for his hand. You know what I was, she said softly. He didn't hesitate. I know who you are. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and for a moment the universe outside fell still. Together, in voices barely above whispers, like a vow spoken not for show, but for soul, they said it. Not a slave. Not a pet. A partner. The stars blinked on, one by one, and this time they were watching something worth remembering. She was never supposed to matter. To the galaxy, she was just another alien sold, labeled, forgotten. To the slavers, she was property. To the council, she was paperwork. But to one man, she was something no price could measure. He didn't rescue her with weapons. He did it with silence, with food, with choice. And in a world that trades lives like currency, that may be the rarest kind of rebellion. She came to sell herself for a future. But what she found was someone who gave her one, not as a slave, not as a pet, but as a partner. And maybe, just maybe, in a universe built on fear, it takes a human heart to remind it what freedom feels like. And if this is what one human can do with nothing but kindness, what will humanity do next? HFY, subscribe for more stories like this. Because somewhere out there, another life is about to be changed.